Every time I record it, I forget to put on the audio, and then I don't have audio for a video. I hate it. Okay, cool. What's up? Let's do this again. Yeah, so I'm finishing up interpreting the 20th century, the struggle over democracy, and right now we're doing a comparison of democracy to non-democratic forms of government, so in particular socialism and communism, and right now we're focusing on the Eastern world, in particular Japan and China. And right now we're focusing on China and a discussion of how its form of government has changed over the years, what has caused its growth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's been fascinating to hear a historical account of the successes of socialism and communism. Obviously here in the United States, the prevailing opinion has always been that capitalism is vastly superior and that socialism and communism have in them no merit. And I definitely think that first part is true, that capitalism is unequivocally superior in basically every facet, in terms of actual outcomes, not necessarily in terms of intentionality, because we all know that communism and socialism are often, or at least purportedly, pure in intention. We'll get to that in a second. But it really has been fascinating that a number of surges in especially Japan and China's economy came because of organized governmental objectives and just government organization. It has been interesting to see that socialism and capitalism actually did play a part in the positive development of China's and Japan's economies. It has been interesting to be confronted just with the reality that the people of Japan and China today are undoubtedly the beneficiaries of government planning from 30, 50 years ago or so. And within this, I think, is an interesting sort of maybe meta commentary on the fact that I think a lot of conservatives would have a lot of issues even admitting any goodness about socialism or communism, that even if they are predicated on false premises or on fallacious premises or on evil or immoral premises, we have to be able to admit that we have to be able to recognize truth in all of its forms, however inconvenient to our prevailing narrative. We all like to fashion communism and socialism, again, as having no merit to them, but look, clearly, they had, at least in some particular localized and specific instances, positive outcomes. And we would be fools and ultimately enemies to truth if we denied that. And so I think it's a shortcoming of both conservatives and liberals to be unable to recognize the validity in other people's arguments. And you even see things like with the Covington Catholic boys, is that as soon as it came out that, really conservatives were right here, or not so much that conservatives were right, but that liberals were wrong, conservatives loved to just latch onto that and say, look, more evidence for liberals being stupid. And it definitely wasn't evidence of liberals being really stupid. Don't get me wrong there. But I think conservatives also need to take a real hard look at themselves and say, okay, sure, this is a datum that corroborates my hypothesis that the liberals are evil or stupid or whatever. But am I using this as justification to then ignore everything else that liberals are doing and saying? Because there's a lot of good stuff that liberals are doing and saying. A lot of their policies, at least their intentionality, is predicated on good things. For instance, liberals on the whole seem to care, at least in theory, more more about the poor, the downtrodden, and things like this. Although there's actually good research that shows conservatives donate more, so conservatives actually put their money where their mouths is more than liberals do on the whole. Once you recognize truth and once you are in the service of truth, you then have a desire and a compulsion to find out as much data, information, truth as possible so that you can make a reasonable decision. And that's ultimately a value judgment that's going to be predicated on your morals. And so the conversation about morals is incredibly important. But then once presuming that you have a shared morality and a framework in which to then make a decision about which institution or which form of government should we select, I think it's really a basic analysis. And this is going to be really superficial, really rudimentary, and really basic. But generally, you just create a risk profile to do your cost-benefit analysis. You say, okay, what is the potential benefit that would be conferred to how many parties if communism, for instance, let's just compare communism and socialism. If communism succeeded, what's the likelihood that would happen, and then what is the extent of its benefit? And then you look at the negative. You say, okay, well, what's the likelihood that it will fail, and then what is the extent of its failure? And as I mentioned earlier, I don't think it's even close. Like, even if you look at the few times or the few instances or the particular areas in which socialism and communism were actually productive, the actual value add during those times, and this is totally subjective. I have really no data to back this up. Just from listening to the audiobook, it sounds like maybe you could expect that like a person's, like everyone's lives might increase by 20%, something like that. Although it does set up a foundation for later future growth, so maybe it's actually greater than that. I don't know. Let's call it like 25%. That's significant. That's very significant. But then you look at the other side. And the chance of communism succeeding is probably like optimistically, generously, 10%. Generously. And then the thing is that when it fails, it doesn't fail small. It kills tens of millions of people. I mean, like, I didn't know about this until last week, but in 1960 to 1961, the Great Famine in China happened. Like 30 to 50 million people died because of, from what I can tell, poor governmental planning. And like this is such an important point, is that it was unintentional. And this, I think, is one of the reasons that really not, definitely not even close to being the main reason, but one of the reasons that we view the Holocaust to be worse, why the Holocaust is so prevalent in our minds, might be, and this is just, again, theory, that the Holocaust was such an active evil, whereas communism is often such a passive evil. Active versus passive. It's like, Hitler meant to kill those Jews. It's like, yeah, you're right, he did. And it's like, oh, I forget who the emperor was in 1960. But like, did he mean to kill 30 to 50 million people? No, he did not. And that is the terrifying thing, is because liberals, they are good intentioned. It's like, they want to do well. They just don't know that they're going to kill millions of people with their premises. Is that their premises lead to destruction. Not all liberals. Obviously, this is a huge, broad classification. It obviously doesn't always prove true, but liberals are so well-intentioned. So well-intentioned. I think in many instances better intentioned than Republicans, than conservatives. Often, but definitely not always. And it's like, that's like the terrifying thing. It's like they think they're doing the right thing. But it's like, no, you're going to kill millions of people. And that's just what happens. It's inevitably what happened with Pol Pot, that's what happened with Mao Zedong, history is replete with these instances. And of course, like, in being idealists, naturally you look forward to the future because you're idealizing, you're projecting what humanity, what society could look like, what politics, what the polis could look like. And so naturally you don't look back. And I think that's one reason why it's so hard to invalidate these communistic and socialistic tendencies, is because they're always based in the future. And so, of course, the future has no ties to reality, and so it's impossible to disprove an ideal. It's impossible to logically refute a dream. And so it just renders moot the scientific process, basically, of like, well, how we should approach this is the scientific hypothesis. You have a hypothesis for what the best system of government is, and I think it's capitalism broadly, and then you proceed with that until it's disproved. But you can't disprove capitalism with a theoretical institution. Like, sure, like a lot of physics is based on theory, but theory that's corroborated by actual data, whereas there's not really much good data for communism. And so it's stupid to proceed as though we should change our government based off of a dearth of data. And yeah, so I guess to sum it all up, the point here being is that communism and socialism had, in specific instances, good beneficial elements to them. They were productive to certain ends. And so what that means is that we should not dismiss in their entirety communism and socialism. We can absolutely reject them, but we should always do it based off of good, sober, comprehensive, honest evaluation and analysis. We are only ultimately self-defeating and enemies to truth if we are unable or refuse to admit the good elements in competing systems. So boom, done, roasted. So happy Sunday. Call your mom, call your dad, tell them you love them. Go to church. Remember that your life is nothing but the summation of your days. How you spend your day today is broadly how you're going to spend your life. So if you don't want to spend your life being a wastoid, have a good and productive day. Deuces.